Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic concerning logical reasoning of UGC NET examination called as the square of opposition. So stay tuned and enjoy. Let's understand what exactly we are going to learn about in the square of opposition. The theory of square of opposition was given by Aristotle, wherein he gave in a relationship between the different types of proposition in a logical statement. Now, when I say proposition, we know there are four types of proposition, which we can highlight right now on the screen. So, all men are rich, no man is rich, some men are rich, some men are not rich. These are the four types of proposition. The first type of proposition, when we say all men are rich, it's called as universal affirmative because all basically it comprises everyone. So it's every man. So it's universal and it's an affirmative statement. So it is universal affirmative. So the quantity here, when we talk about the subject man, here we're talking about universal quantity comprising everyone. And the statement, the predicate is basically affirmative. So hence it is called as universal affirmative. The second statement, no man is rich, is an example of universal negative. Now remember, universal affirmative is denoted using a capital letter A. The second example is of universal negative. Universal, since we say no man, it basically comprises every man, right? And so the subject is basically the quantity is universal, it comprises everyone. And the predicate is rich is obviously, when I say no man is rich, it is a negative statement. So it is universal negative. And the symbol is E, right? Some men are rich is an example of particular affirmative. Some men, so obviously we're talking about a category of men, so it is particular and it's an affirmative statement, so it is particular affirmative and the symbol is I. Last but not the least, some men are not rich. It's an example of particular negative. Again, it's a negative statement. And some men contains a particular set of people. So obviously we talk about it as a particular negative and the symbol is given as O. So A, E, I, O are universal affirmative, universal negative, of a positive, particular affirmative and particular negative respectively. Now, how exactly the square of opposition works? Now, let's try to understand. Square of opposition, basically we require a square. Okay. Now, in this square, what we do is we fix the four vertices right now. Okay. So the four vertices would be universal affirmative, then universal negative. We have a particular affirmative, that is I, and particular negative. Now, how do we fix these positions? This square in totality can be divided using two axes of symmetry. What we can do is, let's draw a horizontal line parallel to both the lines AE and IO, right? So we have a horizontal line, and this horizontal line, if we draw it exactly in between, it's dividing the entire square into two parts. The upper part is universal and the lower part is particular. Hence, the universal propositions, that is A and E, should come as the top vertices, and the particular propositions, that is I and O, should come below. Now, if you divide the same square, let's say vertically, we'll again get two parts. On the left, we have the affirmative propositions, and on the right, we have the negative propositions. So hence, A and I will come together, that is up and down, and E and O correspondingly comes up and down. So I hope it's very clear how do we fix the positions of the A, E, O, I as the vertices of the square. Now, what we need to observe is, let's look at A and E. A and E are both universal, but one is affirmative and one is negative, which means both of them have the same quantity, but they have different quality, right? So the word quantity and quality becomes very important for us to remember. Likewise, the same relation is observed between I and O. They have the same quantity, but different quality. Now, what about A and I, and likewise E and O? A and O, let's talk about A and I first. They are universal. One is universal and one is particular, and both of them are affirmative, which means they have the same quality but different quantity. The same thing is observed between E and O. They have the same quality but different quantity, right? Okay, what about, do we have any other relationship that we can establish? Yes. What about A and O and E and I? They're diagonals, right? Diagonals of the square. A and O, they have different quality and different quantity. The same thing we can see for I and E. So children, based on this relationship, when we talk about quality and quantity, we have been given particular names for this relationship. The relation between A and E, that is universal affirmative and universal negative, is called as contrary. Okay. So if anyone is asking you what's the relation between universal affirmative and universal negative, that is A and E, the answer is contrary. The relation between I and O is called as subcontrary. So A and E is contrary, I and O is subcontrary. What about A and I, and likewise E and O? Remember, both of them have the same quality but different quantity. This relation is called as subalternation. So A and I are subalternations, and E and O are also subalternations of each other. Now, the last set of relationship between A and O and E and I are called as contradictory relationship. So here, we need to remember these four terminologies: contrary, subcontrary, subalternation, and contradictory. So contrary is between A and E, right, towards the top. Subcontrary is between I and O, towards the bottom. Subalternation is between A and I and E and O, all in the pairwise, obviously we need to remember them. And lastly, contradictory is between A and O and E and I. I hope it's very clear. Now, why are we learning this? What is the significance of this? Now, this relation between the different types of proposition becomes very important in determining the truthhood or falsehood of the statement, or the truth value of the statement. Now, let's try to understand this over here. Now here, let me just dim all the terms right now. I'm just getting rid of them as of now. Okay, now what happens when A is true? If A is true, on the basis of A, what will happen to the other types of proposition? Let's try to understand. And to remember it, let's make a small idea. I'll say God resides at the top, right? So Swarg mein Bhagwan hai, so Bhagwan. And remember, God is always true. So remember this very carefully. It's very important in understanding God is always true and God resides at the top. So let's talk about A. A, when I say A, we're talking about universal affirmative. And let's say the universal affirmative is true. If universal affirmative is true, it's contradictory, which means O, that is particular negative, will always going to be false. So when it comes to contradictory, if one proposition is true, it's contradictory always has to be false. So एक true है, एक false होगा हमेशा. Okay. If A is true, what about E? Let's try to understand this. Now remember, because God resides at the top and God is always true, when God is true, two contraries cannot be true together. यानी एक साथ दोनों true नहीं हो सकते. So if A is true, E has to be false. So if A is true, E has to be false. Remember, when two contraries exist, they cannot be true at the same time because God exists. God is always true. और जब God true है, तो contraries साथ में true नहीं हो सकते. Now, if A is true, what will be I? If A is true, I will always be true. Remember, because God can send truth down. God is always true. He can send truth down. Okay? So let's take an example over here. Let's go by the same proposition what we took in the previous slide. If I say A is all men are rich. So when I say all men are rich, let's talk about E. E means no man is rich. If all men are rich is true, no man is rich is definitely going to be false. And if I say all men are rich, it's contradictory. That is O, that some men are not rich cannot be true. And if I say all men are rich, that is A, some men are rich definitely stands to be true. That is particular affirmative. So we can work out such examples. On the next few slides, I'm not going to explain with the help of examples. We're just trying to by heart the relationship with the help of a trick. Now, let's come to the next slide. Here, remember, God is always at the top. God is always there. Now, what happens if A is false? If A is false, it's contradictory always has to be true. That is, if A is false, O has to be true. Now, if A is false, let's see what happens with E. As I said, God resides at the top and both of them cannot be true together. So E, because A is false, E can be true or E can be false also. So what we say is, because A is false, E is doubtful. Remember, अगर A true था तो E false होना जरूरी था, लेकिन अगर A false है, याद रखना दोनों साथ में true नहीं हो सकते, लेकिन साथ में false हो सकते हैं. So if A is false, E could be either true or E could be false. Both are acceptable. So it's doubtful, right? So we say it's indeterminate. We say it's doubtful. Likewise, because A is false, what happens to I? Remember, I also is going to be doubtful because false, agar A false hai, to Bhagwan niche false bhejenge. There is no guarantee. We're doubtful, right? If God is going to send false down, God will definitely send true down, but like false, God will never send it down. Okay, so let's go on. Now, let's look at E, the second statement, that is universal negative. If E is true, okay, let's look at this. If E is true, its contradictory will always going to be false. If A is true, its contradictory is also always going to be false. If A is true, what will happen to, if E is true, its contradictory I becomes false, and if E is true, what will happen to A? A will definitely be false because God resides and both of them cannot be true together. So अगर एक true है, दूसरा false होना जरूरी है. If E is true, what about O? O will be what? Remember, God can send truth down, so O will also be true. Okay, let's continue further. What happens if E is false? If E is false, definitely its contradictory is going to be true. I hope you understand this now. And if E is false, what will happen to its contrary? Contradictory true हो गया. Contrary. याद रखना, भगवान ऊपर है, God is always true. Two contraries cannot be true together. लेकिन एक false है, तो दूसरा वाला true भी हो सकता है या false भी हो सकता है, यानी doubtful है. And remember, can God send falsehood down? No, that's doubtful. So अगर E false है, तो O becomes doubtful. Let's move forward. Come on, chalo. Okay, now what? Let's talk about I now. Okay. Now here, नीचे शैतान का वास है. ठीक है? There's a demon over here, and demon is always false. Now, if A is true, if I is true, if I is true, definitely E should be what? It's contradictory. E should be false. So exactly opposite hoga. So if this statement is true, I is true, E will be false. Very simple. Okay. If I is true, what about O? Now remember, because the demon is false, both the propositions which is associated with the demon cannot be false together. जिस तरह से भगवान ऊपर थे, तो both the propositions could not be true together. That is, A and E could not be true together. यहाँ पे जब शैतान नीचे है, the demon is down. Both the propositions I and O cannot be false together, right? They cannot be false together, which means if I is true, O becomes doubtful, right? Because they can be true together, but they cannot be false together. So अगर I true है, तो O true भी हो सकता है, false भी हो सकता है, right? So that's why O becomes doubtful when I is true. And if I is true, what happens to the universal affirmative? If I is true, now remember, demon नीचे है. Is it any guarantee कि जो demon है, जो नीचे true है, वो ऊपर truth ही बेचेगा? No, it is doubtful. Very clear? So let's try the next thing together. Let's see what happens if I is false. If I is false, definitely its contradictory has to be what? True. Very easy. And if I is false, what will happen to O? Remember, demon is down, and when demon exists, both the propositions cannot be false together. They may be true together, but they cannot be false together. So if I is false, O has to be true. And if I is false, what about A? Remember, there's 100% guarantee कि falsehood ऊपर भेजेगा demon false ही बना के. तो अगर I false है, तो A also becomes false. Very simple to understand. Okay, now. Let's see the last chance now. Let's talk about O. Now, what happens if O is true? If O is true, remember the demon exists there. If O is true, its contradictory A should be false. Very easy. If O is true, What about I? Remember, when the demon exists, both these propositions I and O cannot be false together, but they can be true together. So false भी हो सकता है, true भी हो सकता है. I यानी doubtful बन जाएगा. In the same way, if O is true, what about E? Is there any guarantee that the demon is going to send truthful up? No, it's doubtful. Okay, last chance. What happens if O, the statement proposition O is false? If O is false, it's contradictory. A should always be true. If O is false, A has to be true. And if O is false, what about I? Remember, when the demon exists, they cannot be false together. So if O is false, I has to be true. And if O is false, what happens to E? Remember, there's a guarantee that the falsehood will travel up because the demon is definitely going to send falsehood up. So E becomes false. So in this way, we can be prepared with this different questionnaire that can be asked in the examination in the form of an MCQ. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.